The reality is we're actually pretty similar, and if I really take the time to self-reflect and put in the effort, I can see exactly where they were coming from. All right, so remember how at the beginning of the pandemic, there were people who were protesting the lockdown because they wanted haircuts? Now, in reality, this is a bit of an oversimplification of what was actually going on. The protesters were objecting to the stay-at-home orders that the majority of states were issuing during the height of the pandemic. And so these protests took many forms. There were some who just wanted their everyday comforts back. There were those who took a more religious stance. There were those who wanted things to reopen so that they could earn an income and sustain themselves. And there were others who simply saw this as a violation of their personal freedoms. Nevertheless, haircuts literally became the symbol of these anti-lockdown protests. And for better or worse, that's what we focused on in our responses to them. The Twitter user who originally posted the photo of the woman with the haircut sign accompanied that picture with the message, "If you get infected with coronavirus and you die, I doubt you or anyone else will care what your hair looks like. Just dumb." And that sentiment was echoed pretty much at every level, from other Twitter users who were pretty candid in their apathy towards these people and their lives, all the way up to professional news anchors.
There's an army of people, when I go through New York City, an army of immigrants and people of color and poor people who are keeping this city running. They are disinfecting offices, they are cleaning people, they are changing bedpans, and they are working. And those people are out there complaining because they don't have haircuts? Who the hell do you think you are?
And to be honest, this is also kind of where I landed in terms of how I felt about these protests. I wasn't as apathetic towards the lives of these protesters like some of those Twitter users were, but I definitely believe at the end of the day, these demonstrations and the ideas fueling them were born out of a selfish desire to maintain a lifestyle regardless of the effect that this would have on other people. I mean, the statistics consistently showed that close contact without masks and social distancing facilitated the spread of the coronavirus, and that this spread was causing an unprecedented number of deaths across the globe. And so, as Psychology Today put it, if someone chooses not to practice responsible social distancing, they are also forcing that choice on others. There is no way to prioritize personal freedoms like being able to get a haircut without causing a ripple effect that impacts others, including healthcare workers. People who are willing to reopen the economy are putting others at risk by doing so. And so, because of the data and the research, I still believe that those protests were inherently selfish, and I disagree with the underlying mentality behind them. But my stance on those protests isn't anything new, and it really isn't the point of today's video. The point of today's video is something else entirely. But first, a quick story. So in 2021, sometime after the first vaccine had been administered, I went to go play basketball at an indoor gym with some of my friends. We were all vaccinated, and we'd found a court that had to be reserved and only let one group in at a time. The facility also required masks, but obviously they didn't enforce that mandate while people were actually on the court. Now, I live with my parents, who are both in the age range of people who are more susceptible to some of the more dire consequences of contracting COVID. They were also vaccinated, but this was pre-booster, and there was still a legitimate concern that they could get COVID. Now, fortunately, nothing happened. I went to go play basketball with my friends, had a great time, came home, wasn't sick, didn't spread anything to my family, and life continued on as planned. But whenever I think back on that time, I feel a little off. And for a long time, I couldn't really understand why. But now I realize that it's because that was truly an unnecessary risk to take at that time. Today, we're almost 2 years removed from the first round of vaccines going out, and we are a lot more confident in the vaccine and its ability to prevent not only the spread of COVID, but also its ability to dampen the symptoms of COVID once it's contracted. But back then, there was still a decent amount of uncertainty, even from those of us who'd bought into the vaccine. Obviously, the science was out, and yes, we knew that each vaccine had at least a 60% efficacy rate, with most of them boasting a 90+% efficacy rate. But still, there were legitimate questions being asked about the long-term effects, what types of scenarios we were truly safe in, the effects of having one shot versus two, etc. So even though there was a general air of confidence around the vaccine, there was still reason for concern and skepticism, especially when you consider some of the inconsistent public health messaging from the very organizations who were telling us that the vaccine was safe. And I mention all of this just to illustrate my state of mind at the time, because even though I was confident in the vaccine's ability to protect me, I still had doubts, and I took those doubts with me when I went to go play basketball that day. I didn't know if the vaccine would protect me from a scenario where 10 maskless people were on a basketball court in close proximity, breathing and sweating on each other. What if some of the people I played with that day actually had the virus and were just asymptomatic? And again, the gym that we went to didn't require a negative COVID test for us to enter. They just required us to have a mask in every part of the facility that wasn't a basketball court. The only reason I knew we were all vaccinated is because we talked about it beforehand, but it's very possible that there had been other patrons before us who hadn't been vaccinated and who might have had COVID. And so the reality is that I put not only myself but also my family at risk because I wanted to play basketball with other people. I was tired of running drills at the park by myself every morning. Anybody who plays or understands sports knows that practice is absolutely essential, but you just can't replicate the feel of an actual game. If you really want to improve, you have to get as close to a game situation as possible. You have to play against other people. Practice alone won't get you there. So yes, I was tired of playing by myself, but also there's that time when an older lady walked up to me in the morning, keeping her distance of course, and said, "I see you here every morning playing by yourself. Don't you have any friends?" Now, she was very kind and obviously joking around, but if she knew how close she was to the truth, she would have never asked me that question. But anyway, all of these things were floating around in my head when I decided to take the risk and go play basketball with other people that day. So maybe now the point that I'm trying to make is starting to become a bit clearer. Isn't my mentality in this situation the same as the mentality of the haircut protesters? Obviously, it's not a one-to-one comparison. I wasn't out there protesting. I and everybody I was with was vaccinated. I wasn't defying any stay-at-home orders. I wasn't intentionally and knowingly putting anybody else's life at risk, etc. Contextually, the situations are completely different. However, that doesn't change the fact that our mentalities were the same. In essence, the mentality behind the haircut protests was, I am willing to risk my life and the lives of the people around me in order to have access to these creature comforts. And the mentality behind me going to play basketball that day was, I am willing to risk my life and the lives of the people around me in order to have access to this creature comfort. It's the exact same mentality. Again, I understand that contextually these are very different situations. The risk I was taking was much lower than the risk that the protesters took for themselves and lower than the risk that they forced upon others. I didn't force anything on anybody else. Everyone involved, including my family, understood and accepted the risk that was involved with me going to play basketball that day. But there was still a risk, and the fact that I would take that risk in order to do something as unnecessary as playing basketball means that I can understand the mentality behind somebody else deciding to take a risk to do something unnecessary. Okay, so why did I make this video? I didn't make this to absolve the protesters or myself of any guilt. Actually, it's the complete opposite. I still think that they were wrong to protest. I still think that the ideas behind their protests stemmed from greed and self-indulgence, and I still think that it was absolutely necessary to call them out. But I made this so that I could keep myself in check. I needed to remind myself that I'm not calling them out from some pedestal up above, declaring that I could never understand how they could justify doing the things that they do while simultaneously signaling my virtue to everyone listening. I'm acknowledging that I'm right there with them, making the same mistakes, just in very different circumstances and scenarios, and often with much milder consequences. And that doesn't make me better or worse, it just means that even though I vehemently disagreed with what they were doing, the reality is we're actually pretty similar, and if I really take the time to self-reflect and put in the effort, I can see exactly where they were coming from. And so my calling them out is simultaneously an acknowledgement of my own shortcomings and a recognition of the things that I also need to improve on. But in any case, I think that's going to be it for this one. If you made it this far, I truly appreciate you watching and indulging me. I really hope it made sense. If it didn't, please feel free to let me know and I'll either try to explain further or just make a follow-up video. But with that said, I wish you all the very best going forward. Take care of yourself and I will see you in the next one. Peace.